They say change is the only constant. But who wouldn't want this pandemic to stop changing its impact constantly? As much as we are resilient, there is a huge uncertainty that looms over. Our next session is a panel discussion titled Embedding Resilience, Thriving in Uncertainty. I'd like to invite the moderator, Mr. T.V. Venkataraman. Mr. Venkat heads the internal audit and risk management for Ashok Leyland and its group entities. He brings with him over 2 decades of experience spanning manufacturing and service sectors across diverse geographies in the domains of governance, risk, and compliance. Prior to joining Ashok Leyland, Mr. Venkat was the head of management assurance at the Flipkart Group. Over to you, Mr. Venkat, to introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Aarti. So, good afternoon, Mohit, Vipul, and Anant. Let me have the pleasure of introducing you all. Vipul, I'll go with you. So, for the audience here, good afternoon to you all. Vipul is a co-founder and chief marketing officer of Big Basket and oversees the marketing and finance functions of Big Basket. And as a seasoned senior executive with experience in the IT, retail, and e-commerce space, he has successfully built strong teams delivering results, and specifically in the retail space. And we have, prior to Big Basket, Vipul was the investment director at People Capital Advisors, as also the president of Trinetra Super Retail and at Fab Mall, and he was also the business development manager prior to that at Wipro. Vipul is a postgraduate holder in management and marketing from the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. Welcome, Vipul.
Thank you.
I now move on to our next speaker, Mohit, panelist. Mohit is the CHRO at Lowe's India. And in this HR leadership role, Mohit leads the entire HR portfolio, including the culture development, change management, recruitment, diversity and inclusion, and other initiatives, including CSR at Lowe's India. In addition to these HR responsibilities, he also plays an active leadership role in managing the shared services function like facilities, finance, and security at Lowe's. Mohit has a rich HR experience in the financial product and retail space, and his expertise cuts across consulting, organization strategy, and coaching, as also building organizations. Prior to Lowe's, he has worked with Hudson's Bay Company as the vice president and site leader, and he was instrumental in building and leading the HBC India office as a site leader with a key focus on designing a robust operating model. Mohit is an MBA in HR from Fairleigh Dickinson University and holds a Bachelor of Engineering in Industrial Engineering from the RV College of Engineering in Bangalore. Welcome, Mohit, to the show.
Thank you.
Anant is the third panelist on the call. And Anant is a co-founder of TaikiConsulting Private Limited and HealthContinuum Private Limited, which provides distribution technology and strategic solutions to the healthcare businesses. Prior to starting his own venture, Anant was with Healthcare Global, which is HCG, from 2015 to 2021 as part of its leadership team. For those of you who may not have heard about HCG, HCG is a healthcare services company with leadership in comprehensive oncology hospitals and portfolios in multi-specialty hospitals, which is a chain in India. And it also has fertility clinics and bioinformatics. During this period that Mohit was there, HCG witnessed significant expansion from 12 centers to 26 centers across the country, and also the addition of the bioinformatics business and acquisitions. The company has a strength of 6,000 people and went public and raised additional rounds of funding, creating a substantial growth capability at the organization. Anant, as a head of imagining business for South Asia at GE Healthcare, which is, I guess, prior to HCG, oversaw the release of India-designed and manufactured products such as PET scanners and CT scanners in 2015. Anant, I have lost you on the call. Maybe you will be joining us back shortly. So we will just wait for a second more. This is the risk that we carry in today's times with technology-based programs. I certainly have not wished for his vanishing act, but anyway, we'll just hold on. there must be a power outage, and it's a risk that we are all carrying today. So maybe you will have to bear with us for a minute or so. Anant, welcome back. For a minute, we thought you were doing the Houdini act on the show.
Thank you.
So we will conclude the introductions here. I just wanted to tell the audience, and we may be having a very diverse audience. Unfortunately, I do not know the size of the audience participation today, but nevertheless, I will assume that we have a very large audience with an absolute interest post lunch to sit in this discussion, which is probably one of the I should say most relevant topics that we have today. In terms of building, embedding resilience, and how do we thrive in the uncertain times. Right. So let me just what we will do is, while we have done the introductions of the panelists, I just thought it will be useful to provide a few introductory remarks, and then move on to the panel questionnaire, or the panel discussion, which would be free flowing in nature, and then we will of course have some time for Q&A from the audience, and that's when we tend to learn more as well. So, from my point of view, and Anant again has gone ahead with the Houdini Act, but we will wait. He can join whenever. The opening remarks that I would like to give here, and this is a topic which is one of the most relevant topics in today's times, as I said, and I want to thank IIA Bangalore Chapter for organizing this program and bringing in this topic in today's session. So, good afternoon, all. If the pandemic has taught business leaders anything, it is this: the question isn't if the next crisis will come, but when the crisis will come. So it's not about if, but when. Now, we live in a very volatile and uncertain and complex and ambiguous times. And I think VUCA is a well-known cliche that we all use as business leaders. But I want to just give a perspective in terms of, given the diversity of the experience of that the panel is bringing in, I want to also share from my own personal experience within the manufacturing space, and more recently at my role with Ashok Leyland, which I've been holding the position of the head of internal audit and risk management for the last 5 years. I would like to share a few perspectives from the manufacturing space, specifically the commercial vehicle segment. As you know, the commercial vehicle business, specifically the MNHCV or the medium and heavy commercial vehicle segment, is extremely cyclical in nature. The cyclicality of the business is based on the impetus given to infrastructure, mining, as also the growth in GDP and so on and so forth, right? So the business is further compounded by the fact that the government from time to time brings in newer regulations, whether it be the emission norms. And as you know, we moved in from BS4 to BS6 in a span of 2 years, which in Europe, they also had something which is Euro 5 norms was brought in place before they went to Euro 6. But here we did a quantum leap from BS4 to BS6. Notwithstanding that, the government also brought in additional regulations during 2018 with respect to axle load restrictions and so on and so forth. So whether it is a change in fuel emission norms or whether it is increasing impetus, now, as you know, we are also giving increasing impetus to cleaner energy. So CNG is the name of the game, as also electric vehicle mobility. It will definitely be some years away before the commercial vehicles, specifically the bigger commercial vehicles, gets into electric vehicle mobility. I think that will still take some time, but the lighter commercial vehicles will go on to EV in a very short while. So given the dynamic nature of the business, and on top of it all, we have also had the pandemic in early part of 2020. So if it was not for the fact that, business is extremely, the environment is extremely complex, building resilience has become a way of life. And not only to overcome the cyclicality in our business, but also to ensure that we become the last man standing in this industry, right? So what I wanted to share with the audience as also the panelists is that risk management in the true sense of the term, therefore, has to be integral to an organization's ability to survive in these turbulent times. So now let's get started with that as a backdrop. Let's get started with our discussion. I would like to, first engage with Mohit, and then, of course, we will move on between the other panelists. Mohit, while the other two panelists are entrepreneurs in their own rights, You being the CHRO, and HR is probably the backbone of any organization, specifically where talent pool is fairly large, right? And in a company like Lowe's, and I just want to as I was reading about Lowe's yesterday, I understand you're a Fortune 50 company globally, which has about $90 billion in sales, and that's not a small number, with overall 2,200 stores serving 3 lakh associates across the globe, while the India operations caters to the technology and solution needs of your parent. Now, you know, in that context, as someone who leads the entire HR portfolio for the India business, including culture, development, and change management, etc., let's talk about the social impact of the pandemic, and both in terms of the lives and livelihoods of the employees and your extended ecosystem. And how did Lowe's India go about building up coping mechanisms to redress the same? Over to you, Mohit.
Sure. No, thank you, Venkat, and very interesting question. But first of all, good afternoon to all of you, and IIA, thank you for having me over. Indeed, privileged to be here amongst all of you. So let me take that question. So I think one thing which I would say is the pandemic has reinforced that there are risks, and in some ways it can never be fully visualized. And I think, Venkat, to what you just spoke about, irrespective of the businesses, whether it's manufacturing, whether a business like ours, which is into home improvement, I think it manifests itself in the least expected manner. So these unknowns, as we think about hedging on sophisticated models, data sciences, on what the way forward is, I think the best way to deal with them is what we're talking about today, which is building resiliency and responding rightly and being ready, right, rather than kind of being reactive. So I wanted to touch upon one thing, and this is in the context of social, is the aspect of inclusion. In some ways, as we think about it, this pandemic has separated people from the workplaces, right? And whether it's our colleagues or our daily routines that we probably enjoyed when we were in the offices, in some ways got disrupted. In many cases, it has added to stress. It's led to drop in morale or motivation, and most importantly, fragmented teams, right? So we can all say, yes, we are virtual, we are connected in this, but in general, what has also resulted in, this is again industry data that's saying that there's an increase in productivity. So on one side, we're seeing stress levels increase, but on the other side, we're seeing productivity increase, right? So what I wanted to focus on really is, I believe there are some permanent shifts, and when I say shifts, these are behavior shifts, and this also adds a lot of impetus in terms of what I would say the well-being, right? Whether it's mental, physical, and this needs to be addressed. So what I thought I'll do today is really talk a little bit in terms of what at Lowe's, how we have handled it, and I kind of break it up into phases. And the first phase was when the lockdown came last year, was really ensuring that the employees are equipped to work remote. This was when overnight BCP plans had to kind of get initiated, right? It worked beautifully, right? In 99% of our employees went remote on day one seamlessly, right? There was no challenges on connectivity. But then there was another important step that the organization took. We set up a command center, a COVID command center, to support the tactical needs. And this, I believe, was a very important move, especially during the second wave that we just witnessed a couple of months ago, right? And what the command center did was really focused on providing ground level tactical support, as basic as finding hospital beds, providing oxygen concentrators at home, or even providing medicines to our employee homes. So I think that was a very critical step. The second phase of how, when we talk about resiliency, is also, are we equipping our employees? To that effect, we actually distributed, so we had 3,200 employees here in India. We distributed healthcare kits, and here, when I say healthcare kits, like things like oximeters, BP machines, thermometers, etc., to individual homes of our employees. And we coupled that or complemented that with telemedicine services, 24/7 doctor services, nurse services, which was provided through telemedicine. I think those were some important measures. And the last phase where I believe we are today, right? Because I think whether it's an individual level or an organization level, or even a societal level, when I talk about the community, one of the most critical aspects is the aspect of self-care, right? We need to first take care of ourselves. And towards that, the organization is putting a lot of effort towards a focus on mental health and well-being. And I think in general, building positive psychology as we go through this. So I think a few things to enable that we've done is, of course, vaccinated our employees, but not just the employees, vaccinated the families, dependents, etc., to enable. But I think if you look at what I think we have approached, and I know a lot of other organizations have done that, is it's important to provide that safety net as we think about going through this journey, which is a very important part of resilience, right? When we feel more secure, we feel more safe, that's when resilience comes out. So I think that's a few things that I wanted to share. And I think one thing key as we go through this journey is also communication, right? As an individual, as an organization, I think we need to communicate and be transparent as we go through this together. Back
Yeah,
to you,
that's
Venkat.
yeah, well said, Mohit. I was also curious to know about the customer facing side of the business. I mean, resilience, of course, employees are paramount of importance in terms of their health and well-being. But also, how did you address the customer needs? I mean, was there any communication sent out to customers, or did the business do anything differently during this time?
Yeah, no, interesting. And one of the things, like I said, we are in the business of home improvement, right? And I'm sure Vipul will relate to this. I think our businesses, was disrupted and disrupted positively, which
Mhm.
basically meant that everyone is spending time at home, like all of us are doing today. And this put a lot of load in terms of our stores being open. So while the pandemic was out there, for the last 16 months, we have had to keep our stores open. The 2,200 stores have been open, which means our 3 lakh frontline employees have been in store. And it's not just the frontline employees, it's also to make sure we're creating an environment and creating an ecosystem for our customers, either to walk into stores or to create alternative channels like curbside pickup, which obviously has to be digitally enabled. So for
Right.
us, going back to your question, Venkat, I think it was about really reinventing the business model to make sure that we are staying relevant. Second,
Mhm.
of course, to our customers, it was about making sure that we're communicating. And as a philosophy, I think the company in all the geographies, we mainly North America and of course here in India, we focus on really supporting the communities. And this is not just related to the pandemic. I think we're very
Right.
focused on how we support the community. So that really, I think, came out strong as we have gone through the last 16 months.
Right. So, we'll come back to you, Mohit. Thank you for your insights. And I just want to move over to Vipul. A quick, context with respect to Vipul's business. And I'm sure most of us are aware that very recently the Tata Group acquired a majority stake in Big Basket. Congratulations once again. And, if you were to if you were to look at Big Basket's growth story, and specifically given the gross merchandise value, which has grown 3.5 times in the last 3 years. And we have totally a user base which is at about 23 million. Big Basket is known as an industry leader, which has demonstrated a strong execution capability, built a loyal customer base, and created the online grocery category for customers like me. At least I'm a regular buyer from Big
Thank you.
Basket. So I just want to hear from you, Vipul. Yours is also, as Mohit has also talked about, yours is also a people-intensive
Yes.
organization, right? So while the e-commerce business has witnessed a sort of an upside, but how did you go about managing the disruptions that your business faced, and specifically in terms of lives and livelihoods of your organization? And how would you view building resilience for a business that is still on an aggressive growth path?
No, thanks, Venkat. Very good question. And when the lockdown happened, it was very sudden, and I don't think anybody expected, nor knew what was supposed to happen. And one fine day, the business just came to a halt, and the government said, you're closed for next 6 weeks. We'll allow some essential services, grocery being one, but people were not clear how you could deliver, what passes you required, how would you get people back. We lost 50% of people day one. A lot of them are migrant labor. They went back to their homes, could not get back. Some of them were just too scared to come back. So at one fell swoop, we had half of the people that we needed. We had 3x the demand,
Hmm.
and we couldn't deliver. So it was really probably the worst crisis that any startup or any large consumer company can ever face, where you have a
Right.
million customers wanting product from you, and you're in a position to deliver it. And you fast forward to 3 months from there, we got up and running in about 10 days. 3 months later, we probably delivered 2x of what we had ever delivered with half the number of people that we had. And I think, and when I look back at that, and it's not just us, and when I look back and I look at the ecosystem, a lot of the larger players, whether it was Amazon, Flipkart, a lot of other competition, could not do it. And I was therefore thinking, how did Big Basket bounce back? And I realized that it has to do with 2-3 things. There are long-term factors in play, which are how do you design the organization? How do you actually design the organization to be resilient when faced by any crisis? And how do you build a long-term structural format which allows the organization to bounce back if there's a crisis? And before I go there and I talk about that, I want to narrate a small anecdote, because when Venkat, we were speaking yesterday, it suddenly struck me. In the same day, yesterday morning, a customer wrote to me from Bangalore. This customer is with us now for about 6 years. And he sent a very nice, heartwarming mail. And he said, in 2017, he writes to me, I had a crisis. My wife was in office in Bombay and there were floods. And she got stuck. She couldn't go back home. Right? This guy was on tour in Bangalore, and the children were at home.
Oh.
Right? And fortunately for her father-in-law was in Bombay, so he picked those kids up and took them home. But they had no food at home, and they didn't know what to do until his wife said, why don't we call Big Basket and see if they'll deliver? So he said, in this condition, in floods in Bombay, nobody's going to deliver, and we were not delivering. I mean, we were trying to deliver, but it was impossible because there is no way to even get people to come and work. So they reached out to us. They spoke to a regional head, gentleman called Ashok Taparia, who figured out a way to make sure that the delivery happens. And next day they got deliveries. The guy had to wade through water to reach. And I didn't know this story. None of us knew this story, that this had happened. And that's the beauty of it. There was a minor crisis. It was a minor in the organizational context. For Big Basket, it was a minor crisis. For the customer, it was a major crisis.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, this was really the focal point of trouble for him. So he wanted a solution, and I think the organization delivered. So this guy writes and says, I can't think of any organization which could have done this. And therefore, he says, the test of an organization is, can they actually in a crisis help you? Can they bounce back in a crisis? So when I was thinking about this, I realized there are 3 things that we have done, which is what makes Big Basket resilient. There are long-term factors, and then there are cultural factors. And I'll talk about some of these very briefly. The long-term factors are really saying, how do you design the organization to be resilient? One of the key things is, structurally, can the organization be more resilient? So for example, if you look at it, the way we built Big Basket is that for every activity, whether you pick products from the shelves, whether you put it into a van, whether you load, how do you load the van, how do you deliver to a customer's place, there is a defined process. Just to tell you the granularity that this process has, we have a process where the delivery person, when he enters a customer's house, he has to remove his shoes. It defines, saying you should remove your shoes, you should carry the crates, you should unpack, you should read out the list, show the customer everything is there. When you cut the crate, there is a plastic, which is the tag which is holding the crate together. You cut it, you put it back in your pocket. Don't drop it in the customer's floor, because we walk barefoot in Indian homes and you can hurt yourself. So the process definition goes to that level. And detailing of every process, therefore, becomes extremely critical. Because what does process do? Process gives you a fallback saying, if I don't know what to do, what should I do? It tells you what to do next. And therefore, the moment you have processes, the organization becomes far more resilient. It doesn't necessarily become rigid. People associate process with rigidity. This is not about rigidity. It is about flexibility. You can do what you want, but there is a guideline which tells you which is the best way to do this. And when you have this at every level, it makes the organization structurally far more capable, because independent silos, independent units can take the same decision, can deliver the same experience. The second thing is, how do you design a customer-centric or a very people-heavy or very asset-heavy organization like Big Basket to be far more resilient? So if you look at it, we have multiple distribution centers, the way we are designed. So if you look at Bangalore, for example, and the reason we designed this organization was because we realized the kind of risk that we have. We could have a lockdown in one part of the city. We could have traffic jam in another part of the city. We could have rains, and Bangalore is famous for this. We could have rains in one part of the city and no rain on the other. And you could have the government locking down something else in some part of the city. But the rest of the operations have to continue running. So if your distribution center, if you're one and it's sitting there and it gets closed down, all your operations come down. So you can't deliver. So therefore, we have multiple distribution centers. We have multiple dark stores. So there is so much of redundancy built in the system that even if we shut down any of our, any particular dark store, any particular, which is where we hold inventory, or any particular distribution center, we can continue to operate. We can continue to deliver. Which is why if a city shuts down, we can deliver from another city. If a dark store shuts down, we can deliver from another dark store. And that entire supply chain is therefore built to be resilient. The third part, which we've taken care of, is really saying, how do you make people more resilient? Right? And the only way organizations become, and Mohit is probably the best person to appreciate this, is that they become very resilient, is when you give them, one, you define process, but you give them a lot of independence. And you give a lot of leeway, have a very decentralized approach to business. So if you look at the way we are structured, Big Basket, each of our cities is practically an independent business. While we are one brand, each city is run by practically a mini CEO, each store is run by a store manager, and each of them actually run that operations day in, day out. We have central visibility. At any point in time, we know exactly which order is getting delivered from where. And I can say, okay, in Calcutta today, we have so many orders. Right now, in the next 1 hour, these are the number of orders getting delivered. These are the addresses they're getting delivered to. And I will know which orders got delivered on time, which is not. But I really don't need to talk to the person, and he's managing the operation himself. So when you have decentralized management, that makes people far more resilient. They have the initiative, they have control, and their ability to act when there's a crisis. So these are long-term factors which really design and create resilience in organizations. So this would be a good way to explain how we have built resilience at Big Basket.
No, I think very useful insights, Vipul, and I'm glad you talked about processes. And as an auditor and as a risk management professional, I think what I would look for in any organization is how mature are the processes. And as you rightly said, unfortunately, it is not perceived in that way. But processes are actually enablers to become more flexible or agile, and not really, the roadblocks or the speed breakers. So I think I'm totally with you on this. And on that note, we now move on to the second entrepreneur on the show, Anant. I know your entrepreneurial journey is fairly nascent, but if you can just walk us through. Anant has gone back to his Houdini act, but I'm not sure what's happening. So we will wait for a minute until he joins back. I think he may be having certain network issues at his place. Probably give us 30 seconds. So until such time he joins back, and we'll keep this free flowing. Mohit, do you have a structured risk management program at Lowe's? I mean, how did you, how do you view, risk management across enterprise? I mean, pandemic has occurred. That was a black swan event. I mean, we now know that we should be prepared for black swan events as well. But yeah, Mohit, over to you, and then I'll hand it back to Anand.
Sure. Yeah. No. I think it's a great call out, Venkat. I think one is, of course, we do have a business continuity framework, and that was obviously, at the very beginning itself, it was tested in terms of when we got into the pandemic. But more importantly, I think one of the key things coming through the pandemic is we put a lot of focus on our enterprise risk management framework now, and we've looked at different dimensions of enterprise risk, and I think that's really, if you ask me, I mean, how to kind of get ourselves prepared for another black swan event is going to be in terms of how we test these controls, and a lot of focus towards that is with regard to our processes in terms of testing the resiliency of these processes, and these are on different parameters, and technology or IT being one of it. But I think more fundamentally, it's about our business resilience. It's about our people resilience in terms of and that's, I know we both Vipul and I kind of touched upon it. But I think today, one thing fundamental, at least for us in our business, is we are distributed. So one is, when we talk about our stores, it's about how we are touching our customers physically there. But then we are also now gotten a lot more digital in terms of how we are enabling our digital services. One thing which we have kind of learned from our experiences as we have gone through this journey is to make sure that our teams are a lot more distributed in terms of how things, and this has nothing to do with India, right? I think it's about our teams that are distributed across the globe and how things can be picked up. And like the last 2 months when we were going through a massive wave, it's about how our teams back in the US or Canada could pick up and run, right? I think it's about that resilience. Did it get to that? Right. No. But I think it's about making sure that we had the processes defined. I think that's really what I would want to touch upon as we have kind of learned from our experiences.
Right, and I'll come back to you in a minute. Anant, thanks to see you, and nice to see you again. I do not know if I do not know if there's a challenge with Anant joining.
I think this
Or
risk is one we are not going to be able to solve, Venkat.
we must definitely find some humor in all of
We have
this.
a risky panelist in Anant today, so I think all of us are grappling with that issue.
That's all right. So
So I
yeah,
think we'll continue the conversation. Let me
yeah,
maybe
yeah.
one of the things that I've also realized is that while we one of the biggest problems I think which happens, and it is not so much that people do not want to manage risk or they don't have an appreciation of risk. I don't think most organizations spend time trying to define what risks that business can have. And there are multiple risks. You could have a safety risk. You have a food safety risk, for example, because we deal in say food. We have a safety risk because people work in a mechanized environment. You have a regulatory risk because there's so many you have FSSAI, you have local regulations. We apply for something like 25, 30 licenses every time we open a new city. So therefore, there's a significant regulatory risk. There is a significant safety risk. There are people traveling on the road. So there is a how do you train them on safety? How do you drive safely? How do you make sure that you deliver on time? So if every business, if you look at it today, has multiple risks which need to be identified. And I think the biggest issue that happens more often than not is that people do not spend time identifying what these risks are. And a lot of times it's sort of get neglected because it's not staring you in the face. It's not urgent. It's immediate. But particularly for startups, and startups are even more riskier. So you already have significant risk whether your customers will buy or whether your product will work and all of that. In addition to that, you have all this other risk. So therefore, startups tend to get focused on just on their business risk and not worry about so many of the other risks that they have. But if you can design organizations early, it is much easier to manage this, and you can actually a lot of the risks can get addressed. The normal risks that you can foresee, which can be identified, can get addressed very early on. You don't have to wait for something to happen to really address them.
Now, Vipul, I just want to share a small update from my end as well. When I began my journey with Aditya Birla Group, I was part of the retail business of Aditya Birla Group, which is the More brand of stores, as and I think we touched upon it yesterday. We had acquired Trinitra and Fab Mall. And the first part of the journey was actually putting in all the standard operating procedures in place. So whatever you touched upon in the initial thing in terms of ensuring that the shrinkage is controlled, or even the fact that the merchandise is stacked neatly at the store. One of the things I actually did was my CEO put all of us through my More Store program, where we had to spend time at the store going through each of the operating processes. And I, as a head of internal audit, I had to spend 10 days at the store, managing the store as a cashier, as a front-end sales executive, and all of that. It was a brilliant experience because then I could relate back to the operations. And in terms of setting out the risk management framework for Aditya Birla Retail, that helped me a lot. So that was point one. Point number two, I just came off the risk committee of Ashok Leyland yesterday. We had the risk committee meeting yesterday, the day before. And the directors today are more interested in knowing, considering the pandemic, in terms of, what are the black swan events that can occur. I mean, whether a Suez Canal event will occur and which will disrupt your supply chain, or would you have a situation where the third wave happens, and then how are you going to meet your business targets, or will there be a drop in the market share? I think people have gone away from mere static risk to looking at much more dynamic and the uncertain world. So they are expecting us to be the Nostradamuses, the risk officers to be the Nostradamuses of the organization, to predict what can go wrong in future. I mean, so it's becoming an increasingly complex game to be focusing upon. So Anant, we finally have you. Just hold on for a couple of minutes, Anant, and then you can respond. So we touched upon multiple topics, Anant, and you are also an entrepreneur. So how do you view your prior to your entrepreneurial journey in terms of the business building resilience at HCG? And if you can just walk us through that.
So first of all, sorry, I'm dropping off. My apologies for that. But in terms of pandemic, it was very tough on hospitals. We were running about 26 hospitals, and I talk not just from HCG point of view, but from all other hospitals also. It was a very, very difficult scenario because you had some patients who were already in the hospital, who were not infected patients, who had problems with their immunity, cardiac patients, cancer patients, they're all ICU patients, they're all inside. And suddenly you had this wave of patients who were coming who were infected. So suddenly you had to segregate. You literally had to break your hospital into two phases. One is for infected people, one is for non-infected people. And there was so much of confusion. The front-ending nurses, staff.
All right.
I think we have lost him again.
So we will proceed with our discussions.
Yeah.
So this is healthcare is one industry, I'm sure, where the frontline staff has had a significant impact, and the whether it's you're a caregiver or a frontline doctor, you definitely were exposed to the risk factors arising from COVID, and most of the hospitals, as I know, were all treating patients with COVID. Yes, back to you, Anant. Anant, you're on
The
mute.
government was struggling with, yeah, the government was struggling with regulations. Every fifth day, the rules will change. The way we have to treat will change. We didn't have the test kits, how to admit the patient. So almost every third day, we had to review the process and we had to change the process. We had to segregate staff. We had to put staff on 7-day week. Every 7 day they would get tested, and then take a week off or 10 days off and make sure that they're not infected and come back. So what used to be a 7-8 hour job became a 24-hour job because everything became slow. Every patient, every family member who walked into the hospital had to be tested. So there were dual risks. One is more than business, the patient risk. There were dual risk. One, the patients who are already admitted inside the hospital, we had to make sure that they are safe. They're not going to get infected. And there was other pressure of the new patients who are infected who had to be treated separately. So the staff had to be separate, the infrastructure had to be separate, and just to explain, hospitals, you have MRI machines, you have CT machines, you have X-ray machines. They are all common, and they are the most important things. So we had to actually, after every patient scan, we had to put in a process of disinfecting the machines, take a new scan, take a new patient. So what if we could do 4 patients an hour? We started doing 4 patients in about 2-3 hours because of the disinfection process. So every second, third day, we went through a lot of process change, and the first wave really taught us a lot in terms of how to handle it. It was tough. The families of frontline people, nurses, their families, doctors, their families. It was very tough, and there was a lot of fear in the first wave. I would think compared to those second wave were far more disastrous. The fear factor in the first wave was far more, because we didn't know what is likely to happen. So a lot of doctors got infected, nurses got infected. The first few, when our staff got infected, first few staff, the panic among family, because there were no private hospitals taking patients. We had to go to the government referred places, and there was a lot of confusion. But I think in about 15-20 days or a month's time, we could reorganize the process. We slowed down everything. We segregated. So a lot of reprocessing of everything that happened over a period of time. And that learning came in very handy when the second wave hit. So by the time, I think most of the hospitals, including ours, were pretty much had the processes in place and things like that. And also, since we are multiple location based, every government, every city was coming up with its own rules. There were different rules in different cities. There were, sometimes the local authorities would allow, don't allow. So it was a very, very, very dynamic situation in first couple of months. The business, because of lockdown, one more thing that happened was the people who were not COVID patients but cardiac patients. Just to share some numbers, which I would quote, is in last April, May, June, the cardiac procedures went down by 80%. There were no cardiac procedures, absolutely no cardiac procedures.
Right, I can imagine.
Cardiac procedures are done, just didn't happen because the diagnosis was not happening. So our worry was similarly the cancer patients. the cancer surgeries which have to happen in time just didn't happen because patients were not coming, because there's a 1 month of diagnosis that happens. After that, the surgery and the staging, everything happens. That process stopped because what we call as OPDs of doctors who see patients outside, not necessarily inside the hospital, but family physicians, some super specialists, they had stopped coming to their clinics. So the entire, the supply chain, what you may call as in the patient journey, that got disrupted. And what we saw towards the later part of last year was suddenly there were spikes in the number of cancer surgeries, number of cancer
Right.
patients. So we saw that coming. But the issue with cancer is the more time it takes, it's very difficult to cure. The issue is that's the issue with cardiac, but which is much more faster. So it's very hard to really figure out what's the damage, because we know this, we front end this. It's really hard to understand what's the damage, but it has been a significant damage to a lot of patients, COVID as well as non-COVID. So,
Understand.
but when the second wave hit us, I think all the hospitals were pretty much ready with ICU beds. Of course, there was shortage, but pretty much ready with the process. The staff were much better. Vaccination was
So,
done.
Anant, what I have been reading about is increased stress levels across your caregivers, and whether it's doctors or the nurses. There is a lot of stress that has impacted their lives. How did you deal with the emotional well-being of your doctors? I mean, I'm sure today, as employees of a company, of a corporate, we are providing a lot of these assistance programs to ensure that there is emotional and mental well-being is addressed in different ways, through counseling, etc. How did you go about it?
Yeah, I think if you look at hospital staff can be primarily divided into three sets of people. One is administrative people who take care of billing, who take care of all the back-end processes, HR, finance, billing, all of that. The front-end staff, which is important because they navigate the patient through various departments, A to B to Z, and also technicians who have to be with the machines and all that. They are not clinicians, but they're front end, who have to be stationed there to make sure that the patients are taken care, the machines are taken care, the infrastructure is taken care. The third piece is really around the doctors and nurses, who are the clinical staff, who really touch the patient, who really handle the patient. So it's not just the anxiety of staff, it's the anxiety of patients. So fundamentally a human anxiety, which includes patients
Absolutely.
as well as staff. So for all the administrative staff, we said no need to come because they just have to work from home or just operate from where they were there, because we didn't want to infect the hospital with too many people coming in and going out. So there was a clear direction given to non-patient facing staff not to just come at all. So that reduced a lot of traffic, unnecessary traffic that used to happen in the hospital. That was point number one. Point number two, we divided the hospital, which is doctors and nurses, into two wings. One particular portion was particularly focusing on COVID, and the other one was focusing on non-COVID, which was our regular diseases, what was going on. And we would give a week off after. There was a rotation that we created, the kind of rotation where people will come. There were testing done for them every week. In fact, we started with every third day because the issue with COVID is, as many of you know, even if you get tested immediately, your infection will come to light only after 5th or 7th day. 7 to 11 days are the critical period. So even if you test negative, it really doesn't mean anything. So we had to give that cooling period off and made them stay at home, isolated them. In fact, we reserved a lot of rooms inside the hospital, all our 26 hospitals, a lot of rooms for isolation, because we didn't want them to go home, because many of the nurses are young staff. They have their families, they have their in-laws, parents, small children. So all of those, so we couldn't have that. There was a risk of them going home and infect their families. So we reserved almost 25% of the rooms for these people to just stay isolated. Some of them got infected. We treated them inside the hospital. But fundamentally, the first few cases were very tough to handle because the families were upset. The first case I remember when, my day used to start at 4 in the morning because 4 or 5 I would get a report of, we would send all the test samples of patients as well as staff. 4 or 5 before it gets published to BBMP, I would get to know who are all infected or not infected. And it would end at 12 because there were 2 rounds of testing that used to happen. So we used to talk to their families, get them isolated inside the hospital. It was tough. But after 2-3 cases, as people started recovering and coming back, I think people got confidence. The first one was
Anant,
not so bad.
we have about 10 minutes before we get on to the question and answer session. So maybe what we'll do is we will try and wrap up the discussions with some key messages for the audience and then get on to the
Sure.
Q&A. So I have to manage the time. So, I didn't mean to cut you in, but you can close it and then we'll get on to the last question.
Sure.
About 15 minutes, 15, 20.
Yeah. Okay. So, if I were to ask Mohit, any closing comments or tips that you want to share with the key messages that you would like to share with the audience?
Sure. No, I mean, Venkat, I think today's topic is very relevant to where we are. And I think if there's any tip that I would want to kind of leave the audience with is one, when we talk about resilience, it has to start with ourselves. It has to start at home. I think that's extremely important when we talk about the aspect of resilience. Second is, I think when we talk about the social support or social ecosystem, it's important to make sure we keep the connections. I think that's, as we look at a business resilience, I still will emphasize the individual resilience comes when we are able to make the connections and draw the energies from around us. So that's a second. The third, I would say, is I think Vipul and Anant spoke about it at length. Really is around the in this environment. I think one thing which is a clear takeaway is our agility and our ability to make decisions. Or in other words, what I would say is having a strong bias for action. Right? I think we need to act. I think that's important. And I'll just kind of leave my last kind of thing with an interesting story that comes to my mind. When a grandfather was teaching his grandchildren about life lessons, he spoke about a battle that's raging within himself, and he said it's a terrible fight between 2 wolves, and one wolf represents fear, anger, envy, sorrow, and the other stands for joy, peace, hope. And what he told the children is this fight is going on between us. It's going on within me. It's going on with all of us at any point in time. So one of the child asks the grandfather, so which wolf would win? And I think that's really what I wanted to conclude with is the one you feed. Right. I think that's the critical aspect of resilience in terms of as we think about building these muscles in terms of resiliency. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Venkat. Thank you.
Oh, that's an awesome anecdote to end the conversation. But that's brilliant. I think we should live in a world full of hope and positivity. Vipul, over to you in terms of the key messages for the audience.
Yeah, I'll quickly summarize. One, I think risk identification, do it early. It's easy to do. Most people know what the risks in the business are, but it's just about being diligent, not waiting for the risk to transpire before acting. And the moment you identify the risk, you will know what to do. And I think most of your problem really gets solved there. And once you've identified the risk, design your organization, design your processes to take care of it. And as long as you do that, you will build just by virtue of doing this, following this discipline, you will build a more resilient organization.
I concur, Vipul. In fact, there is a saying that let us not drive the business forward using the rearview mirror. We must look ahead, and there has to be a constant evaluation of what the horizon will unfold or how the horizon will unfold. Yeah, Anant, any thoughts for the participants?
Yeah, I think the resilience that I saw, particularly from the healthcare segment, I think came in from nurses. They are not highly well paid, but really who really front-ended and took the burden because the doctors see patients for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. So, my takeaway was a lot of resilience for us comes from our front end people, and we really have to be thankful and we really have to take care of them. That's where our resilience comes from.
Sure. So, taking care of people, and also the fact that, nurses are capable of showing the empathy, because, showing the empathy to the patients, and also, the ability to have that inner resilience as a human being to one another, during these crisis times. I think that would have stood in good stead. We are now open to the Q&A from the audience, and I'm just hopeful that we will be able to hear or at least see the questions on the chat window, or I do not know how the questions will be passed on, but yeah, over to, yes, there are some questions that are coming up on the chat window. There is a question for me, I guess. In the manufacturing sector, specifically the automotive sector, we have witnessed multiple disruptions on the raw material side. To keep the production line moving with fast-paced onboarding of probably new suppliers or some similar situations, how has the IA team played a role here? Well, I do not know whether the IA team has played a role with respect to managing the disruptions, but I can certainly vouch for one thing, that sometimes in hindsight you also learn something new. So the pandemic has definitely had disrupted due to the lockdowns our supply chain capabilities. I think what we've really done, and as a risk professional, what we've done is articulate the supply chain concentration wherever there's a concentration risk, as also a geographical risk, because the fact that if you look at an auto sector, typically majority of the suppliers are concentrated in a few belts. I mean, I can talk about Maharashtra or the Gurgaon belt or the Tamil Nadu belt around in and around Chennai. Having said that, when you have certain lockdowns, it will impact or disrupt the supplies that are coming in from that location which is undergoing a lockdown. I mean, specifically if it is Maharashtra, for example. So, notwithstanding that, we have de-risked ourselves by looking at alternative suppliers. We have, I do not think concentration risk is something that we've carried for long. We do have one or two suppliers where we do have concentration on because of the specific nature of the product. But as far as the role of internal audit is concerned, I would say it's fairly negligible. As a risk professional, it is our duty to translate those risks into helping the business identify and putting or chalking out a plan of action for mitigation. So that is the only message I have. How could you manage the liquidity during the crisis? And I'm not sure who this question is for. I would pass it on to Mohit.
So I'm just kind of reading the question. I mean, here from I'm reading liquidity here from an balance sheet perspective, and how we have kind of handled it through this crisis. So I think and I can talk about it from our business standpoint. I think like I said, I think for our business, it was a very different environment. And one of the things I think we touched upon, and Vipul I think spoke about it, is we had to really relook at how our inventory and our distribution centers were going to be working. We had to hold more inventory in the beginning of the pandemic. So for us, I think the question of liquidity, I think, was our business was growing. Our business was growing 2x as we went through the pandemic. And for us, liquidity for 100 years, we incidentally celebrate 100 years this year as an organization, right? I think we obviously tapped into our reserves. I mean, being around for this long, I think we were able to kind of look at our reserves as we went through the aspect of holding inventory and making sure that our supply chain was not getting disrupted.
Yes, let's move on to the third one, which is perhaps for Vipul. With e-commerce becoming mainstream, how have you utilized internal audit to review and strengthen the IT infrastructure? Has there been an increase in the systems hacking attempts, specifically in the last 1 year? And where do you see areas to improve with respect to agility from your internal audit teams? Let's assume that your internal audit team is not agile.
No, our internal audit team is extremely agile. So I don't think that is a problem. I think one of the things that we realized, interestingly, is that information security for a particularly an organization like ours, which is actually a retail organization, is a paramount importance. And all the things that I talked about, process, about control, about design, actually apply to tech 10 times magnified. So designing your access control systems, auditing them, making sure that they are functioning the way that they are supposed to, doing having information security as a critical part of internal audit and having your auditors reviewed. So we have a 2 or 3 month audit every year on our entire information technology platform by our auditors, right? And this is then followed up with internal audits. Is followed up with internal audits which are done by the team themselves and not by internal auditors. So there are multiple levels of testing which is done for the architecture. That's the only way you can figure out whether something's working, not working. Are access control systems working well? Are your database controls working well? Are there gaps in your architecture which will allow somebody to hack? And in spite of all that, finally hacking is a result typically because of people making a mistake. You may still have an incident. In which case, how do you limit damage? What happens if a person? How do you build your tech platform to be resilient so that you have even if a person makes a mistake, the damage is not cataclysmic. It is limited. It can be controlled, and it does not really spill the doom of the organization. I think so. Designing tech becomes a very key thing. Designing information security becomes very important. Having people who manage this, having such roles identified, having managerial talent which looks at this becomes very important.
Vipul, on that note, I just thought I'll have a follow-up question. Is there an appropriate governance mechanism? I mean, I do not know whether you have a audit committee of the board or someone to that effect, a governing body who interacts with the internal audit team to understand the nature of the operational risks or other regulatory or financial risks that are carried within big basket. And is there a
one of the
review?
things we do is actually to address that is the founders themselves and our management team actually reviews the internal audit report every quarter themselves personally. And it's not about, it's not the function that I look after. We are looking after all functions. So you're reviewing the internal audit report across all functions, looking at what's happened, what has not worked, what needs to be done, making sure that those corrective actions take place. So that mechanism is very useful. And then obviously you have an audit committee of the board, you have an audit committee, you have auditors, external auditors. In certain areas, like I mentioned, technology, we also use external auditors to assess, because this is such a specialized field that we use external auditors just to assess whether we have whether a tech platform is working well, it continues to work well, are there issues that they see which are not working.
Absolutely. No, I think technology risks are something that every board today is well aware of, and they keep asking us the same questions as well. Okay, moving forward, the liquidity question was also meant for Vipul, but if you have the time, Vipul, why don't you also respond to the fact that how could you manage liquidity during the crisis?
No, I think like Mohit mentioned, our business went through an upsurge. So we had the reverse problem. We had more liquidity and less of a problem from there. But so therefore, that was not really an issue for us. I think one of the questions that came in, I just saw as saying, how is your pricing strategy varied during pandemic? It did not change. I mean, there's no different pricing strategy. We are not charging customers more because it's pandemic. We're not charging them more for delivery. In fact, we were actually working with lesser people. We managed and delivered more. So a lot of our costs went up incidentally during pandemic. People assume that because you've lower people, your costs would have come down. It actually did not, because you're taking care of people. You had social distancing, so you could not deploy a lot of people. You had to give people more time. You had to pay people more. You had to take care of risks associated with delivering during this period. So actually, the operating costs went up quite significantly, and we also obviously covered all our people with insurance, provided healthcare benefits, provided other benefits to them which could help them tide over these times. And therefore, the costs really went up, but there was no change in our pricing policy.
Excellent. So I'm glad to hear that, because whenever I try and book an order through Zomato or Swiggy, I mean, I think in Zomato I recently saw a surge price and for the delivery, and I was a bit stunned because I thought that really applied to Ubers and the Olas of the world.
Yeah,
okay,
I think
so on
that.
Yeah, on that note, that was probably the last question that we have from the panel. I didn't see any other question here. So we have come to the end. I think we are almost at the end of the program, but thank you. It's been a very real pleasure. I think the key takeaways, as far as I'm concerned, is the very fact that businesses which are strong on processes will remain agile and will have the flexibility and be able to manage resilience or build resilience better. I think we need to also look at from a resilience point of view from the people angle, and that's the most important in terms of how do we ensure that the people have been given the due flexibility and the encouragement, as also the support in terms of extending an empathetic view to their condition, and also the fact that as we always use a cliche term that people are an organization's most critical assets. We always hear that, but now this is probably the best time when we have realized that how organizations have taken care of its employees, and that helps build the resilience as far as the organization is also concerned. So point well taken, Mohit. And Vipul, thank you so much for your time. Mohit
Thank you so
and
much.
Anant, thank you so much for your time. I have enjoyed this discussion, and I do look forward to our interactions. Over to you, Arati.
Thank you, Venkat. Thank you, Mohit. Thank you, Vipul, and thank you, Anant. Venkat, you showed true resilience handling Anant's Houdini act. It was not sure what's happening, but like you said, this is the challenge that we face while doing it on a digital platform. Had we been in person, then not possible, really.
Right. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time today at our session, at our event today.